It's episode 185 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner.
As always, you can find all of the archives of the show at hankgarner.com. And when you're there, please click over in the right-hand sidebar and subscribe to the show. When you subscribe, it boosts us in the algorithms and helps other people find the show. And I would really appreciate if you did that. Also, over at the website, we have a brand new Facebook group. You can find it at facebook.com/groups/Author Stories Podcast. There's also a link in the show notes. And come join over there. We've got almost 1,000 people in the group already. We're doing some great giveaways, and I'm posting some show specific stuff there, upcoming guests and different things like that, and we're having a lot of fun, so I hope you'll come over and join us. We've got some brand new sponsors this week for the month of May, and I want to thank especially Armand Rosamilia. We're going to highlight several of his books over the month, but I want to start today with his book Dirty Deeds. You may remember that Dirty Deeds was a Kindle Scout winner. It's a crime thriller, the first in a series, and it's available exclusively on Amazon and Kindle Unlimited right now. The gist of the book goes like this. I get paid to erase problems. Did your extramarital affair produce an unwanted complication? Family problems? Just want to enjoy your midlife crisis by yourself? That's where I come in. For a fee, I'll take care of it. A big fee. Only I'm not going to do what you think. I'm going to save you from them. I'm going to save them from you. Pick up Dirty Deeds by Armand Rosamilia. Another great sponsor we're welcoming this week is Tricia Gilliam. Tricia has a new book called Out of the Gray, and it's book 5 in a series, so if you're looking to get into a long series, this is a great one to get started with. When an Earth-based terrorist group targets Hanaria's ambassador, 2 teenagers become entrapped in the conflict. Alex Varon is the son of an Earth Independence Party representative and doesn't want to follow his father's path of political manipulation and corruption. Rika Miller is the adopted daughter of an engineer and nurse who later discovers she's not human, but Hanarian. Alex must decide between his family loyalties and saving the life of an alien he's been taught to fear and hate, while Rika searches for the truth of what happened to her birth parents. Book 5 in the series by Patricia Gilliam. It's called Out of the Gray. There's links to everything in the show notes. Also, my good friend Stefan Boltz in his new book, 6 String. Jennifer Dalton dreamed of being a singer for as long as she could remember. The dream has kept her alive throughout a childhood mired in poverty and a broken and abusive home. When her younger brother dies and her mother takes refuge in alcohol, the emotional toll becomes unbearable. One morning she runs away, taking with her the one thing she owns, her beloved 6-string guitar. This is the story of a girl finding herself alone in the good and the bad, the friends she makes, and a choice that can rob her of everything she's won. That's 6 String by Stefan Boltz. There's links to everything in the show notes. Stay tuned after the show for an audio clip from Richard Gleaves and the Jason Crane series. Thank you for listening.
Hey there, Author Story listeners. This is Kevin Tomlinson from Draft to Digital, and I know that you have a book sitting there just waiting to get out to the world, and you're kind of wondering what the next steps are. So that's why you need to go visit drafttodigital.com/authorstories. That's draft2digital.com/authorstories. And that's where you're going to find all the help you need to go from having a book on your hard drive to having it on someone's Kindle or iPad or other reading device. So go visit drafttodigital.com/authorstories right now.
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm very excited to introduce Winston Groom to the show. Mr. Groom is the author of numerous books and has a long and storied career as a writer. His newest book is called El Paso, and we're going to get into that, as well as another book that you might have heard of, Forrest Gump. But Mr. Groom, you have had an interesting career, from journalism to history to fiction and all around. But I begin each interview with a question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Oh, Lord. I think it was when I was about 7. There was a story contest in the Mobile, Alabama Press Register newspaper for Christmas stories, and I entered the contest. It was for children, and I won it with a one-paragraph story, I think it was. And I got a book of Grimm's fairy tales as a prize. I've been stealing from it ever since. And for some reason, I think back on it, because the newspaper later, much later, fished out that copy after Forrest Gump came out. And they fished out the copy of the story that I wrote, the original, and framed it and presented it to me. But and actually, Truman Capote used to tell the story where how he won it. But there's absolutely no record that Truman ever won it. But it doesn't surprise me. But anyway, after that, I think somewhere that was the germ. But I went through many iterations before I decided to be a writer. I mean, I was meant to be, I think, a lawyer like my father. Most sons of lawyers did that in my time. They went and joined their father's law firm. But I changed in college, so I'm not going to do that. But anyway, that was my first conscious memory of the pride of publication. So I think my old friend Paul Delaney, who was a reporter for the New York, he worked for us in Washington, and he went in the New York Times. He used to call it psychological remuneration, which is to see your name in front of a story.
Right. And that's a powerful thing.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Now, you grew up in Mobile,
I
right?
did.
Mobile, Alabama. There's a certain thing about being born in the South and being raised there, and we have a strong tradition of storytelling. Maybe it has to do with the hot afternoons and sitting on the front porch and drinking iced tea or whatever.
Don't you have air conditioning over there yet?
Well, we do, but if you watch movies, that's we're all sitting on the front porch,
Of course, that's the way they want to portray you out there.
That's right. Oh man, do you come from a line of storytellers?
No, we told the truth. We were very truthful people. No, I don't. Yeah, I mean, your grandparents who were always. That's what they did, most of it was, as I remember, it was about either about people who lived well before you were born, meaning my grandmother would tell stories about her father, who was in the Civil War. And he lived, of course, until the 1920s, which meant that my father knew him well. And it would either be that, sitting around the Sunday dinner meaning lunch,
right?
Or they would talk about what was wrong with them. At which point I would ask to be excused to go out to the water and fish or whatever. But I think Southerners. I don't know if Northerners do that. I've never been to. Well, I have been, but they don't really have those traditions. And so I think that just it. I don't know. I don't want to pigeonhole myself into this because I'm not really. I mean, I've been identified as a Southern writer, and that's not true. I mean, I've written, as you know, the El Paso, my new book. It's about people from Boston,
right?
And most of the novels that I've written have not been about. Well, I don't know. I haven't taken account, but a great many of them have not been about people from the South. But still, if you come from the South, you're identified as a Southern writer no matter what. You could write about people in Bolivia, and you could still be, as a Southern writer.
Right. And I guess that's kind of what I was getting at is that Southern writers, just because you're from the South, kind of get wedged in there.
Well, it's because I think of Faulkner and his heritage, and he was identified as a Southern writer, and he was. He didn't write about Yankees. He wrote about people from the South, and then, there were a spate of writers. Walker Percy comes to mind. Of course, the great Willie Morris, who was one of my dear friends, and other people. They wrote about Southerners, Southern customs and mores and so on, and so they were identified as a Southern writer. There were a group of poets, Southern poets, John Crowe Ransom and Robert Penn Warren, who lived and taught in the South, and they, of course, wrote about what they knew about, which I think is certainly the extremely appropriate thing. But I never felt like I was a Southern writer in the sense that I always wrote about the South.
Right. You've been quoted as saying that you wanted to be a writer, but you felt like you didn't have anything to write about until you went to the Vietnam War. What happened in that experience that opened you up as a writer?
I got shot at. I mean, you ain't nobody till you get shot at. Let me tell you. I mean, it's trying to say there was that, and there's so much writing today, and I don't mean to be hypercritical, but I've tried over time to read these stories, and I've looked at novels and things by people, but these people have never done anything, and so they write about themselves. That's what the writing skills, and I hate to say it, but I'm kind of down on the writing skills. I blame it for bad literature. Because these folks have never really lived a life. A lot of them, they seek some sort of inward questioning or peace or whatever it is about their lives. Well, nobody gives a rat's ass about their lives. I mean, really, they haven't done anything, and so you get these sort of psychologically driven novels or soap operas, and it's just, I don't know. I think that if you don't really have to do anything, but you have to have the imagination of having done something, like Faulkner. Faulkner didn't really do anything, right, but he could certainly make things up about people that did things. I guess it's because he read about them. But whatever it is, to get a sense of dramatic tension, to me, you have to have people doing things that are dramatic and tense. And so many of the novels that I read today, I get about 20 pages in, I said, what? It looks like there's nothing going to happen here. And,
it's a lot of navel gazing.
Yeah, and that is the times we live in also. I mean, we tend to do that. People tend to think psychologically, at least, well, maybe not where I live, but in certain parts of the country, they're already psychoanalyzing you before you get 10 words in your mouth. I mean, the worst kind of people I've ever known are the people who've been psychoanalyzed, because they become fascinated with it, and they go around and psychoanalyze everybody else, and it'll drive you damn crazy. I mean, to have especially these women, and so they go through this psychoanalysis. That's all they can talk about, and then they are suddenly experts at it, and the conversation goes in what my friend Peter Matheson used to call in a downward way.
So you prefer stories that challenge us to see the world as bigger than maybe our own flawed view of things just around us.
That's a fancy way of putting it. I'll choose stories. I try to, where something happens, and it's something usually is dangerous. And I think that's what creates dramatic tension, a sense of danger. Now it could be some kind of psychological danger, but most of what I've written, if I'm sitting here looking up on a wall at some of my books, and let's see, the first one was a war book. The second was a dog book, but the dog got loose. It's called Only. It's about a big English sheepdog, and it's about his adventures. He got loose and wandered the country, and some of it was very dangerous. He got into fights with other dogs. He was attacked. He got injured, and all these things. There's a danger there. And then let's see, what else did I write here? It goes to Gump book, and I wrote a book called As Summers Die. And there was a certain danger there, and that there were people trying to kill a man. That's very dangerous when somebody tries to kill you. And Gone the Sun, there was this, it began with a suicide. So that's just the way I write, and I do it because I think you got to get the attention of the reader. And then you can go off on all sorts of paths, such as I did in El Paso. I mean, there's a lot of politics in there. There is sociological things. As a sociologist can make a couple of full meals on what I had in El Paso. But first of all, you got to have something going on that you can keep returning to when the reader's eyes glaze over, and then you go back to a shoot 'em up, and the reader's eyes open up again. And that's the way I try to do it.
Now, not only do you write fiction, but you've written several fantastic history books, and you mentioned earlier the family connect. Right, and you mentioned earlier this family connection with the Civil War and some of your immediate ancestors that you could, almost touch, through a close connection to that period.
I think it gives you a sense of a closeness with it for some strange reason. And I mean, my family has fought every war this country's ever fought, except I think Afghanistan or something, or Iraq. But it were not a military family. It's just they happened to be born at the wrong time, or the right time. But just they were born with sons of the age, everywhere from the Revolution right on through the Korean War. That they have been in that, and it fell to my lot. To go to Vietnam years ago, and so that gives you a reality of. I'll tell you that the interesting thing. Every writer has got some kind of juju or totem or whatever you want to call it that they use personally. Steve Ambrose, who was a friend, his deal was, and I learned this from him. I went over to have lunch with him one time. He lived in his office, was out behind his house, and he was writing that story about the Transcontinental Railroad that was built in the 1860s. And I went into his office, and he had under a huge piece of glass an entire topographical history somebody had built. And it was obviously had been at a museum or someplace, but it were little figures, little tiny men working all the way from from I think Utah no, not Utah, but St. Louis, where this thing started, out to Utah, where the two trains met, and it was a bas relief map of well, I don't know, 1,000 miles. A beautiful thing that he had bought. He found it somewhere, and he said that whenever he writes a book, he would try to find some physical object that he could associate with. This thing was probably 12 feet long, and it was quite an extravagant piece of. Somebody spent a lot of time doing it. In other words, they had all the elevations and the tunnels and the bridges for 1,000 miles, and they reduced it down to little tiny men that were probably a half an inch tall, working on this thing. So, hundreds of them, and. Anyway, I said, well, Steve, what do you do when you finish the book? He said, I don't know, I just give it away, throw it away. But he did that. And so I started doing that a little bit with the histories that I write. And the first one I wrote was, what the hell was it called? It was about the Battle of Nashville and Shrouds of Glory. That's right. And I had my great-grandfather's cavalry sword. He fought with General Wheeler. And he didn't go to that battle, thank goodness, because he'd have been killed in it, probably. But he actually followed General Wheeler followed General Sherman and harassed him as he marched to the sea at Savannah. And that's where my great-grandfather was shot in the knee. Carried a cane the rest of his life. I got a picture of him, but I have his sword. And after that, I didn't collect things so much, but I've got a tremendous picture of old first-rate black and white photograph of Pancho Villa talking to General Pershing. I had that when I was working on El Paso, and I've got another terrific photograph of. I'm writing a book now called The Victors. It's sort of after the three-man trilogies I've been doing on the aviators and the generals, and now the Victors are Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt and Stalin, and I got that wonderful picture of them at Casablanca sitting there together. And so, I try to keep those things in mind, to look back at history in a sense that I can say to myself, this really happened. That's what you're writing about.
Right. Well, I have your book, Vicksburg, 1863, because that is a very important thing to me for some family history, and a lot of the stories I write are in a fictional town just north of Vicksburg, there in the Delta.
What's that called?
And it's called Weston, Mississippi. It's a little town I made up, and it features in several stories that I've written. So I consume a lot of history about that place and that time, and one thing that I truly love about your book is that it's narrative history. It's a history book that is not dry history. It is, you have a way of bringing these things alive and making you care about the people and the place and the stuff. Like you said, this is something that actually happened and makes you feel invested in it. Is there any, and I like what you said about using the totems or something to kind of anchor you to that place. Are there any things that you consciously, when you're writing history, that you look for to make that real human connection?
Well, I think that, so as opposed to someone who has been teaching the subject for 40 years, and they have a view of the subject, I come in it pretty fresh. And I sort of deliberately pick subjects that I don't know much about, because I think that I can bring that kind of freshness to it. And I also think that as a novelist, and I think of myself, I always had until, well, I mean, I still do, I guess. I got a novel out, but I think of myself as a novelist, and I think that I see things stories that a trained historian would probably say, poo-poo, I'm not going there. That's not really, but I'll go down that path because my editors have to rein me in. But I will do that because I like to say about something that this is interesting. Let's go there and see what it is. And that takes you into the human element. It takes you, I think you try to bring it alive. There are, of course, very certain rules that you have, between history and fiction. And you can't really violate them for the better story. But you can certainly tell a better story if you can substantiate it. And so I look, when I write a history, I kind of look at it like I'm writing fiction, but you just have to double check your facts and make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed.
Right.
But also, I do it really weird, man. I mean, I realized after a while that I was doing the Civil War backwards. I mean, I started off with Shrouds of Glory, which was the Battle of Nashville, which encompassed the Battle of Franklin, where 5 Confederate generals were slain, and it was pretty much the end of the war in the West. And that was the first history I'd ever written. And the reason I decided to do it was that after Forrest Gump, I got to cogitating, which is never a really good thing for a writer to do, but I did. I was thinking, if you write one good novel, one successful novel, you're extraordinarily lucky. And if you write 2, you're really, almost beyond extraordinary. Like, if you do 3, you're like, that's almost an impossibility. But the thing about it is, most American writers, and there are some exceptions, but they do all that, and then they keep on writing novels. And it's not that they're not good writers; they're perfectly decent writers, but they run out of ideas. And what happens is the critics get down on them, and then the public gets down on them, and the publisher gets down on them, and then that damn agent gets down on them, and their editor gets down on them, and they wind up, like, say, Fitzgerald or Thomas Wolfe, they drink themselves to death, or Hemingway, he blew his brains out. And that was not a path that I particularly wanted to go down. And I thought, well, now what the hell can I... And I thought, I've always enjoyed history. I just enjoy it. I won the DAR History Medal when I was in the 7th grade, I think. And so I liked it. And I thought, I could do that. And so I said this to my editor. He said, are you nuts? You just written Forrest Gump, you're going to write this? I said, yeah. But I knew because I knew him and I knew where he came from. And I said, I want to write a history of the Civil War battle in Nashville. He came from Nashville. And I got him. He said, terrific, we'll do that. And so, I wrote about that was at the end of the Civil War. And then I wrote the Battle of Vicksburg was in the middle of the Civil War. And then I wrote the Battle of Shiloh, which is the beginning of the Civil War. So I did it actually backwards. Shelby Foote would be laughing at me. He was a good old friend. But I've enjoyed the Civil War, and I'm thinking about doing something else. I'm not quite sure what it would be. But I tasted blood again when I published this novel. It's out now. I put my novelist hat back on, so I don't know exactly what the hell I'm going to do.
Well, the Civil War, can be a very contentious subject to talk
It
about.
is now. It wasn't when I wrote my books, but it has become something that is unfortunate, I think. And I'm not sure. I had somebody ask me to write a Civil War book, I published it, and I said, no, I'm not going to do that now. To see how this plays out, because you got the history erasers are out there, and you just don't know how whatever you do would be received, and it's just it's a tough thing, because I try to do it in a way that I believe is truthful, and I don't want to be pushed into any kind of thing that is some kind of false narrative. That seems to be the catchword these days.
Yeah. Well, what do you think we can do as writers when we do write about things that are difficult subjects, things that maybe are blights on our past, or maybe even things that are misunderstood, and try to bring the truth out, but public opinion is kind of already made up about something?
I'd say you avoid it like the plague. You put your little ballet slippers on and tiptoe all around it. But it's a good question, and when you write something, it's a whole lot of trouble from the time that you say you're going to do it, and the publisher, he's paying you a lot of money, or sometimes no money. But there's a lot that goes into all this stuff as editors, and so you don't want to put something out there and put a bullseye on it. Hell, not even any critics anymore, and no more reviews to speak of. At least they're all very few compared to certainly when I first started writing, but even 10 years ago. That's the first thing that has disappeared from newspapers is the book page, because it costs some money, and they say it's the least read page, or at least they don't. It disappeared from most newspapers that I know of. Certainly over here in Alabama, we had a great book page in the Mobile Press Rush, and they fired the guy. Was a wonderful guy, and he had a very intellectual page there, but they did it all over, and it's true in most newspapers. The publishers are going crazy because they, rely on reviews to sell the book.
Right.
Most of them don't take out these big ads and things, and so it's become a vanishing thing. But I don't know where the hell we started here. I'm trying to remember where I'm going.
We're talking about controversial subjects and how we approach
what I was saying was that you don't want to put a bullseye on yourself, and so I don't know. I mean, some people thrive on that. They have ideology in mind, and that is a whole different schemata. People do that. They're argumentative to start with, and they put something out there because it's going to start an argument. I try not to start arguments if I can help it. I found it doesn't win you many friends.
You're right. And your new book, El Paso, does deal with a lot of contentious issues, but you present it in a fascinating, sweeping, kind of epic scene that I'm really loving. I'm about halfway through the book now, and it's really fascinating. Where did the idea come from to tackle this subject?
Well, it came from a friend of mine who has passed away now, a guy called Eddie Morgan, Edmund Morgan. He was a New York Morgan, and a friend. He would take me to the Knickerbocker Club in New York, the lunch or whatever, and sometimes he would get into the subject of his family. They were They were not the J.P. Morgans. That was, I think, an uncle, something, great uncle. His family was, I think his grandfather was the governor of New York, and they were in the financial business too. But anyway, his family back in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, the government of Mexico, and Mexico was at that point in the stage of sort of eternal war and revolution, and northern Mexico was a huge part of the country, and there wasn't anything they could do with it as far as infrastructure. They had a lot of subsistence farmers up there who were besieged by Indians, and it was just there were no proper roads, and certainly no railroads, no jobs, no nothing. And so they, in Mexico City, decided they would see what they could do to improve that. And what they came up with, they would sell off large portions of that country to wealthy Americans in exchange for them doing something to help the people. And so they sold huge, millions of acres to Harriman, who built railroads. And he built railroads, of course, in America. He was one of the railroad kings. He built them down there. The same tracks are still in use today. And Guggenheim, he made another whole fortune in mining down there, copper mining, gold mining, silver mining, tin mining. And in the Morgans' case, there were a lot of people. Whitneys were down there, and Hearst and Herrera's. The Morgans, they had a ranch of like 1.5 million acres, and they had all these cows on it. A huge number of cows. They had so many cows at one time. The Swifts or the Armors or somebody in Chicago called up and said, "We need 35,000 head of cattle next week. Can you supply them?" And the ranch manager wired back, "What color?" And so that they were but Pancho Villa at that point, my friend told me, had been, he left the Americans alone. But suddenly Woodrow Wilson in 1916, before we entered the First World War, for some reason decided he was going to recognize Pancho Villa's arch enemy, General Carranza, as a legitimate ruler of Mexico. And he not only that, but he cut off Pancho Villa, who had an army of 50,000 men. He cut him off from supplying himself with arms and munitions and other supplies in El Paso. And it made Pancho Villa very angry against the Americans, and he went to the Morgan Ranch, and he found the ranch manager, and he strung him up and had him sabered to death. And he kidnapped his kids. And this was just one of many, many stories that Eddie used to tell me about he going down in his private rail car, and the story about the bear, the performing bear that he bought, that got loose in the train. There's a whole bunch of little. There were stories. They weren't a novel. They were just a collection of good stories. And I had to really do some serious cogitation on that over the years. How am I going to turn a novel out of this? But there were too many good stories to go to waste. Right. And so I figured out that I would have this family from Boston, and I always try to do that when I write. James Jones once told me, he says, "Whoever your major character is, make him as different from you as you can, because you will. It's always going to be you, but if it's really you, you're probably going to put him in a situation where he's going to have to do something that you wouldn't do, and then you'll be in a bad fix." And so I chose this family from Boston as the main characters in this story. And they went down there, and it was their kids that were kidnapped, the owners of the ranch. And that's when I changed the name. I didn't use Morgan or anything. But then the rest of the book is just basically it's a manhunt through the high Sierras after Pancho Villa his band who kidnapped these kids. And so it's kind of a big adventure story. I'm trying to remember, where am I going here? Lead me, guide me, lead me back, lead me on, Lord.
I love the story, and I love that it's this big, epic adventure story, like you said.
Well, nobody's written one of these things in years. And I had the damnedest trouble selling this thing because its time had. I mean, nobody was publishing it. Nobody's published anything like this, I think, since Lonesome Dove. And I got to thinking, it seemed like Lonesome Dove was yesterday. That's 30 years ago. And the publishing industry has changed. They want these thin little screeds published by Knopf or something, who used to be one of my publishers. I love very much. But it's just that the editors, these kind of tweedy guys who came out of the University of North Carolina or Pennsylvania or Yale, and they were willing to make a sacrifice by not going into the Wall Street, and they smoked pipes and had leather patches on their jackets, and were really erudite, smart people. And they started in an industry that didn't pay much to start out with, but they figured if they stayed there long enough and were any good, they were going to be comfortable, and they were. And I knew them, some of these guys, when I started out. But they had been replaced by a new breed of editor. A lot of them are, and God, I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but they're women, and they go to these publishing houses, and of course are hired as coffee go-getters. But Daddy is paying for, they went to Smith or they went to Radcliffe, whatever. Daddy is paying for the apartment in New York and all the other stuff. They're making, a couple $100 a week or something. It was just not, you couldn't live in a garbage can up there for that. But they then get to read a manuscript or two, and they find something, and ultimately they wind up being the editors. And or there are guys men who kind of do the same thing, but it's just a different breed. They're all very young these days, and they're looking at fiction. Publishers looking at fiction differently in as much they look at the cost of the book. You got a 175-page novel, it's going to cost a heck of a lot less than almost 500-page novels of what I wrote.
Right.
And they don't have the slide rule anymore. They got a computer though, and they can know how to compute all of these different costs, this thing shipping and selling, and what the big guys wanted. You've got Barnes and Noble and these big booksellers, and they want shorter books. People don't have time to read big books. The big books scare people. And so I tried to launch this thing, and also it was actually bigger than what I wound up with. It was probably closer to 700 words, or 700 pages. And at one point, a couple of 3 years ago, I just sat there and said, this thing's too big. So I cut out about a third of it, and it makes it read a lot better. But I cannot think of anybody else who's in this business, because all the people who I knew, and I was very fortunate coming up as a writer, to have known probably just about every one of the best novelists in this country, and known them very intimately. I lived out in the Hamptons. Well, I lived in the city, but I had a place I didn't know what the Hamptons was at first, and I don't know it now at all, because now it's all hedge fund people. But in my day, which was the late 70s and late 80s, it was writers and painters and movie people. It was like my friends were James Jones, who wrote From Here to Eternity and all the World War II books, Irwin Shaw, who wrote Rich Man, Poor Man, and The Young Lions, and Peter Matheson, and George Plimpton, and Ed Doctorow, and Truman Capote was out there, and I became a good friend of Truman's. He liked me because we were both from Alabama.
Right.
And John Knowles wrote a separate piece. I had so many names that are too famous to drop. But that was I called the East Coast writer. Joe Heller wrote Catch-22, lived out there.
Yeah.
And became a good friend. And then there was a whole different bunch that I called the Montana Key West connection. And I got to know later Tom McGuane and Phil Caputo and Jim Harrison, and they all became friends. And just about all these people are dead. I mean, McGuane's not dead, and Phil's not dead. But then P.J. O'Rourke became one of my best friends, and just in and out. But so many of these people, they've gone. And there's a different group of writers who've taken their place, but they write a different kind of a story. They don't. I don't know whether they went to writing school or what it was. They didn't seem to go to the school of hard knocks like so many people did.
Right. Well, speaking of telling different kinds of stories, we have to talk about Forrest Gump for a couple minutes here. First off,
good.
I know you've never talked about this before, but yeah. There's this book kind of captured the imagination of America. It was especially with the film that came after it, but. This story is so odd in a wonderful way that you have this protagonist who's a simpleton and kind of an outcast. A throwaway as my friend Jim. Yeah, is it really?
Simpleton, outcast, pretty well.
Right. But this character who as my friend Jimmy Moore says, a throwaway in society, he finds himself in the middle of kind of every important thing that's gone on in his lifetime. Where did the idea for this come from?
Well, I've been asked it 1,000 times, and the best way I can describe it is it started with a story that my father told me. And I was living in New York, and I was coming back in the wintertime to a little town called Point Clear, Alabama, where I live now. It's across the bay from Mobile. It's a sort of a resort. But anyway, my daddy was getting old. He was a lawyer there in Mobile. Mother had died, and I would come back because first of all, I hated the New York winter, and second, I wanted to spend more time with him. So I'd see him for lunch every few days. And one of these lunches, he began to reminisce about his childhood growing up in Mobile. He was born in 1906, if that gives you a sense of the setting. And these sort of hot and dusty streets in Mobile, Alabama, there was a young man in his neighborhood who was what they then... The kids would chase him and tease him and throw sticks at him. And one day this young man's mother bought a piano, and kids watched it be delivered into the house, and within a day or so, this beautiful piano music came wafting out of the windows. And there was this young boy, he was a prodigy, and he was now, I guess, I don't know what the hell he's called now, but it was then called idiot savant, at least when I wrote Forrest Gump, because the 60 Minutes CBS show had featured one of these people who their minds are not, they can't tie their own shoes, but they can do incredible mathematical problems or musical things. They can remember things, and the mind is very much concentrated rather than being broad like, normal people are, they can only do one thing.
But that one thing is amazing.
It can be amazing. And so I got home that evening, and I said, I'm going to sit down. And at that point, I had a typewriter, I think. And I said, I'm going to make some notes here before I forget this. Maybe I can use it as a scene somewhere later in some novel. And by late that evening, I had done the first chapter of Forrest Gump. And it's just, I've told people this. Joe Helen told me one time that Catch-22 wrote itself. I'm not sure I believe him, but this did. What I call that lizard brain, which is down the back of your neck. And it went right through the regular brain onto the 10 fingers, onto the keys. And I had no notes, no outline, no net, no research. I just sat down and started writing, and I'd say every morning, well, what we're going to do with him now? And I, all through the thing, I had this creepy feeling I was wasting my time. And when I got finished with it, I didn't know what the hell I had. It's like I went fishing, and I caught the strangest looking fish you could bring up there. And what is this? So I wouldn't even show it to my agent, but I showed it to Willie Morris, who was a very close friend, and he was down at the University of Mississippi then, teaching he was a writer in residence, and I'd known him out in the Hamptons, and so I asked him if he'd read it, and about a week or two later, maybe not even that long, I got this phone call about 2:30 in the morning, which was his preferred talk, and I knew it was him because nobody else had called me, and I picked up the phone and said, Willie, and the other line said, don't change.
You dropped out. You said, don't change
He said, don't change a word of it.
Oh, wow.
And so I sent it to my agent, who sold it within a week to Doubleday, and the next week he sold it to Warner Brothers, and there it vegetated at Warner Brothers, and they sold it to Paramount. Paramount made the show. Right, kaboom. And so there it is, and it came out, and I was in Savannah or something, and I got up one morning, I turned on the TV. I was in a hotel, and I looked and I saw this trailer for Forrest Gump, and I said, Jesus Christ, this is a big deal. They had it on the Today Show. I mean, it was a big trailer. And I'm thinking, these people are behind it. Because I had it's not my first rodeo. I had other movies made of books, but this one, of course, they did get behind it. They were just jumping out of their skins when they, saw the rushes and everything. So it turned out to be a huge movie. It is a life changer. I got to upgrade my brand of toilet paper and everything. It's it makes a big difference when they make a big movie out of you.
I can imagine.
I mean, the only problem is they keep wanting you. Everybody, they want you to do the same thing over and over again.
Right.
And it's just it drives you crazy. I mean, and they can't stand it when you don't, because they can't pigeonhole you. The critics, they can't pigeonhole you, and the publishers want you to do it because they're making money and everything. But I drive them crazy because they can't. I mean, when they think I'm going to do a novel, I'll do a history. When they think I'm doing another history, I'll do a novel.
That's a good place to be, though.
It is a good place to be. I like driving people crazy.
It helps you sleep at night, too, to know that you did what you wanted to do.
Well, yeah, and I can do that now. And I don't consider what I do work. I mean, I just enjoy it. It's more fun than a barrel of monkeys. And it's been a hell of a ride.
I bet.
It ain't over yet.
That's right. Did you get feedback from readers on Forrest Gump? Did that book resonate with people? And
oh God, yeah. I mean, I can't tell. I got a website, and because I got letters from people, and especially after the movie, because they don't differentiate between the book and the movie. Most of them have seen the movie,
right?
and there's a difference. But the movie, they caught 90% of what was I tried to do in the book.
Yeah.
And so I get this probably 2 or 3, 4 times a day. I get, not that I look at it that much, I get a web page, and I get people find it and just write something. Not, as they say, I just can't tell you how much this has meant to me and my family, and we watch it, 10 times a day or whatever. But that's gratifying. It makes you feel good.
Sure does. Sure. You followed up that book with a sequel, Gump and Company, and it has some scenes in it that I truly love, like when Forrest loses the recipe for Coca-Cola, and then that's how we got stuck with New Coke in the mid '80s.
Yeah.
That had to be a lot of fun to write.
That was a lot of fun to write, and what happened? A sequel is a very tricky thing, because the critics will land for you. I mean, they hate that. They say, he's just trying to do this for money. Did I do it for money? Damn right I did. Everything I did. I don't do this for a hobby. I mean,
right.
But the publisher wanted me to do it, and I said, yeah, I'll take a shot at it, because it was that point, it was kind of formulaic. I said, okay, I didn't think, when I put Forrest in all these situations, I didn't see in my head that that's what I was doing. I had the character, and I'm thinking, how am I going to get the reader to believe this? So when I was writing the thing, I was probably in the first chapter, maybe the second, I had him play football for Bear Bryant. And I'm thinking, if I can get the reader to believe that a perfect idiot is going to play football for, a guy with an IQ of 60-something is going to play football for Coach Bryant, they'll believe anything. I get them to that point, they can believe that. So I took them there. And I sort of had myself believing it. Well, then, I can make him do anything. I can make him go to outer space, which I did. I could make him do any doggone thing in the world and put him in these situations. And I'm thinking, if the reader is going to believe that first thing, he played ball for Bryant, then he's going to read. I've got him on the hook, and they're going to believe everything, or they're going to put it down and say this guy's a nut, meaning me. And it turned out that they didn't, and so bring me back from where I'm going off on.
That's
Reel me in.
We were just. Gump and Company was the sequel, and do you ever see Forrest showing up again in a book?
Nah, I don't think. Well, look, Paramount bought that book. They paid me an enormous amount of money, and they paid everybody else an enormous amount of money, including Bob Zemeckis, the director, Hanks, the screenwriter, to do this next Gump and Company is a movie. And it stalled because, if I understand it correctly, because that movie was so big with Paramount that they gave essentially the approval rights to Hanks and Zemeckis. And, well, hell, they each made $80 million or something in this thing. I mean, they made an enormous amount of money. And, you create an 800-pound gorilla.
Right.
In Hollywood, they don't have, they do what they damn well please. And my understanding is from one of the producers, the screenplay was produced, and they didn't like it that much, and so they just sitting on it. And there it sits. But if they ever made it, and somebody, if it was a big hit like Forrest Gump, and the publisher came to me and said, "Will you write a third Gump?" I might try it. I mean, I don't know, but my inclination would be that I would certainly listen to them.
Sure, absolutely. Mr. Groom, thank you so much. This has been I'm sorry, Winston, this has been a fascinating hour. It has gone too quickly. But your new novel is called El Paso, and I want all of my listeners to go pick up a copy of it. It is fantastic. You'll love it in the vein of McMurtry or Joyce or these kind of sweeping epics that, like you mentioned, we don't get to see very much anymore. But I want to encourage everybody to go pick up a copy of it. Where can people find you to stay current on your work and to maybe dig into your archives of stuff that they didn't know that you'd written?
I got a website. It's just WinstonGroom.com, I think. I don't go to it that way, so I don't know. But that's I don't even know if it's up to date. I think there's probably a couple of books behind, but it's pretty close. It's got a lot of stuff in there. It tells you how to get in touch with me, email and that kind of thing.
Well, Mr. Groom, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. I'm going to send everybody over to see you, and I wish you continued success.
Thank you very much. This is a pleasure to be on with you.
Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves. Pick up the entire Jason Crane series. Link in the show notes.
He was just 7 when his parents died. Eliza received the news of their death on Halloween morning, but she kept it from Jason for 2 more days. She sent him out trick-or-treating. He was a vampire. He spun around in the living room, eyes wild, shouting, "I am the living dead!" and wondering why they didn't laugh. On November 2nd, after school, Eliza told him. His parents were dead. It was a bleak time. He wanted silence. He wanted darkness. He cried great rolling tears. In early spring, he ran away from home, which means he stole $5, put a box of Cheez-Its in a pillowcase, and walked 7 blocks. He slept in a field, glad to be miserable. He wanted to freeze to death, to be with his mom and dad, to not feel anything. His grandmother found him at a playground near the river, fallen in the dust with his shoulder against the slope of a teeter-totter, the other end riderless, suspended. He saw her trudging up the hill. She looked twice her usual size in her winter coat, and frightening. "Let's go home, Jason." He knew he was in trouble. He knew what home meant. It meant a paddling or worse. Eliza opened her big winter coat and, straining, slipped down into the dust next to him. She drew him into her warm body, wrapping him in the coat. She flipped the collar up, rubbed her hands together, and cupped them over his ears. "Brr, you're an ice cube. But it feels good, kinda. It's good to get really cold sometimes. Wakes you up." They were cheek to cheek against the teeter-totter, bundled together as the sky turned from gray to orange. The ground stung, but they sat a long time. "Why?" The word was just a tiny puff of vapor that slipped from his lips and into the wind. But it was also big and heavy. She knew what his little boy heart had asked. She understood the universe of longing and confusion and hurt in that one whispered word. "We all die, baby. In all the long, long history of the world, there's not been one of us who didn't." "I'll die," he said. It wasn't a question, but it was. "Yes, and I'll die. A lot sooner. And the why is just... it's just there. It just is. We're not around to see what was before us, and we're not here to see what happens after." The trees on the edge of the playground shivered with dawn. "But we're here now," she said, and pulled him tighter until his cheekbone felt sore from pressing against hers. "And it has to be enough. It has to be. Look at all we have now. Really look." He really looked. It was just a small playground off the main road of an unimportant New England town. But in the distance he could see the wide Kennebec River, and the sky was pink above it. He saw small ships moored, trimmed in red and baby blue, rocking against the current. He saw a robin on the railing of a dock, toes pointed inward, making occasional hops that were also flight. The town was waking up. There was a light in the bakery and one in the grocery. There was an empty can of beer on a picnic table and wildflowers by the road. There was wind and trees swaying gently. There was his own breath in his own lungs. There was his grandmother, her body, her heartbeat against his back as he leaned against her chest. There was his own life and hers, and a world to live them in. And it was enough.
You've been listening to the Author Stories podcast with Hank Garner. You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. When you're there, please subscribe to the show and leave a comment over